Much and most of what we do is out of habit. So to pay attention to what our habits are and then to intercede those that we don't like and, start practicing new ones. I think that's a great way for all of us to maybe enter into some of these womanist practices and traditions, particularly because they are womanist. I don't think that they are something that we necessarily, as Black lesbians, have to learn. I think it might be something we have to remember.
Welcome to the Zami Nobla National Organization of Black Lesbians on Aging podcast. We are your sound source for Black lesbian herstory. I'm your host, Angela Denise Davis. We are so glad you've tuned in to our first episode for 2019. It's an interview we recorded the latter part of last year with Jillian Ford, a professor who trains teachers how to make a difference in the classroom. I so enjoyed my conversation with Jillian because she shares with us the path of finding your vibe and your tribe. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did.
My name is Jillian Carter Ford. I go by JJ. I identify differently at different times, but I'll say I am a Black, white, biracial, queer, cis woman who is very tuned into vibrational energy. And I think that in my 40s, which I've just reached a couple months ago, I'm coming into being able to claim that that's something that is real for me. And it feels really good to be connecting with other folks with whom I share the vibration and just kind of finding my tribe. It's a beautiful tribe.
Well, thank you for being part of the Zami Nobla podcast today and coming by and sharing some good vibes with us. Let's talk a little bit about how you show up in the world on a day-to-day basis, because I know you're also a professor. Tell us a little bit about what keeps you busy every day.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for asking. Those things have really been changing in the last 2 to 3 months also. So, everything in right timing. I do have an official title of a very formal, quote unquote, important job. I'm a professor. I'm an associate professor of social studies education at Kennesaw State University. I teach in the secondary and middle grades program, and I teach mostly in-service teachers courses about how to enact, or I should say, how to disrupt the status quo at their school context. So we, with my students, I have them reading a lot of books and resources that point to equity issues. And part of the courses that I have created is that the students learn how to assess the context that they find themselves in as classroom teachers and ask a certain set of questions or certain sets of questions that the answers will yield where the inequity may lay and possible solutions. And then, the course is about teaching them how to build those coalitions, starting small to be able to make change. I love it because I get to work with people who come in, like a lot of people who are so overwhelmed with all that they have to do as classroom teachers, all of the pressures that all of us are under these days, and for classroom teachers, I know that it's magnified, certainly compared to my job and my occupation. Like you said, how do I show up every day? I have a very privileged ability to show up when I want to and not show up when I don't. And that's huge because, in some ways that's freedom, certainly freedom to do with your body what feels good, at that moment. And that's huge. Most people don't have that. So I definitely recognize that. But I love working with these students because it's very gratifying to work with people who over the course of the semester start to learn the actual skills, because there are actual skills. People do this. People do make change in policy. There are steps to doing it. There are toolboxes available. I draw on a toolbox in particular from the University of Kansas.
Oh.
Yeah, University of Kansas has an incredible toolbox. It's called Community Toolbox, the Community Toolbox. And I know it has at least 35 chapters because I draw from chapter 35. Okay. And then each of the chapters has several subsections. But chapter 35 is about how to make change in policy, more particularly educational policy.
Wow, that's huge.
It's huge.
Huge, because that's what the difference is, I have learned, in terms of what happens with our kids, what they learn and what they don't learn.
It's huge.
So have you been in this area of the academy for a long time, or has this something that has morphed into your professional space, or did you come in thinking about, I want to be in this particular area?
It's definitely morphed. Thank you for asking. No, I came in specifically to teach in the MAT program and to build up the MAT program. MAT is Masters of Arts in Teaching. So these are people, my students were people who had graduated with their bachelor's degree, and they were now going to become middle or high school teachers in the subject, the content, of their undergraduate degree. So that meant that, automatically people have to have or take other prereqs to be, eligible to enter this kind of MAT program. Very concrete majors, undergrad. You have to be bio or chem, or, you could be biochem. You have to be history, which I was, or English, to be able to become a teacher through that particular route. There are a lot of different alternate routes of, teacher preparation, of course, but the one that I was involved with, the MAT, had those boundaries. So I got to work with people from anywhere from age, 23, they had just graduated undergrad, to people in their 50s and 60s. And I really enjoyed the people that I met through that. They're just adults from all over, who want to be teachers. So it's a great group to work with. But what I did not like was that I was teaching these courses that had already been developed. So they never really made sense to me. So for years, I was teaching at KSU before I got to develop this course that I'm telling you about, and it's Contemporary Issues in Educational Equity. It's a master's level course, but not MAT. It's a MED.
Okay.
Yeah, and most of my students are actually getting their specialist or doctorate EDD. So it's awesome, and I really, that's the part that I love. This is my second year teaching that course. So it took, 8 years. It took 7 years for me to be able to get to where I am now.
It's fascinating to me because I've always been interested in education in terms of having a good foundation for children, but also the opportunity for adults to have continuing education and opportunities to go into the academy later in life. Because so often we say, oh my gosh, I'm 50, I can't go back and get a master's or a Ph.D. That's well beyond what I can handle or what I should be thinking of at this point in time.
That's right.
And I think having a diversity of those voices in your class makes a difference.
Yes.
So when you encounter folks who are going out and who are planning on teaching, what do you see the future like, particularly as we talk about Georgia and education, and you can answer that in a broad way or a narrow way, just about what's the future of education here in our country and in the state of Georgia? And I know that's a big question.
Yeah, but it's pretty simple answer. It's not looking good, if things go on how they are right now today. If we do not make a major change, it's not a pretty picture. What's coming up nor what's been going on, but it could only get worse from here, I can imagine, so it's not a pretty picture, but the benefit and the highlight of the way to look at the silver lining is, to me, it seems like there is a very accessible technology that we can all access, that if people would stop denigrating womanisms and Black feminisms and sit down somewhere and listen for a minute, they would know that we could change damn near on a dime. We could change that if people would sit down and take a breath and get some oxygen into their cells.
That is a perfect segue into what I want to talk to you about in terms of your most recent keynote address. But before I do that, I want to just go back and ask you, what are some of those major changes we need to see in education? And I'm particularly interested, since you are in the area of policy, what that looks like. I remember when Daniel Moynihan died a few years ago, and he was the one who was, responsible for that infamous the Moynihan Report, which really had a very negative impact on the perceptions of African American people, especially African American women. But one of the things they said about him was that he sat at the table of policy. And because he sat at that table, so many things were created that had his particular thoughts about who should get what and who deserves what and who needs what. And there are not many of us who are sitting at these high tables of education at the policy level who are able to affect change like that.
Right. Yeah, you're right about that. I think that's what really excites me the most about the class that I developed and the class that I get to teach now, because what I'm doing is helping classroom teachers learn to identify those policies at the local school level that they can interrupt. And so what it looks like, at different levels, of course, is different, but it's similar, because what I am teaching them are things that I have been doing at the college level in terms of faculty and staff organizing that have been successful, over the course of my 8 years, which I'll talk about in a minute if you want. But talking to them and having my conferences with them, the types of policies that they are working on are, some of them are explicit, some of them are more traditions. And that same toolbox from University of Kansas steps you through what is policy, and it talks about different levels of policy. It talks about different spheres of influence and, agents of change within, like, thinking about policies and stuff. And so several of my students, for example, I'm sure not coincidentally, because they are my students, are the final project for the class is to write a proposal that after the class, you would hypothetically be able to, my students will hypothetically be able to turn the proposal into their principal to start an initiative at their school to push back against the status quo, which is white supremacy in their schools. And so a lot of their proposals are proposals to start book clubs, about the things that they have noticed as the inequities at their school. So there are some common themes that now I'm teaching it for the third time. I'm starting to see a lot of my students are concerned about. Certainly overrepresentation of Black and brown kids in disciplinary pipeline, school to prison pipeline. What my class does, for an example with that, is that my students come, they're all teachers. They know, they're like, these Black and brown kids are getting punished so much, but they may or may not know, probably don't know about the school to prison pipeline. So I help give them language for that. But also things like overrepresentation of white kids in honors and AP classes, and things like dress codes, and also transportation issues, like who has access to summer school, just different ways that there are kids in all of these places who are being disenfranchised daily. And that's just the way things are. That's just the way things go. They just don't get to get a good education. And so, you know, again, I guess I just really love thinking about with my students, how can I do something to interrupt that?
I'm glad to ask you that question because your answer really forces me to revisit the initial question, because your answer really talked about the way in which when policy is created from observations on the ground, right, how that is quite different from people like Daniel Moynihan sitting up at the high table of whatsoever it shall be.
Exactly.
And making these trickle down policies, which of course we know never trickle down, but empowering people to really have enough observation and critical thinking skills to say, hey, we need to implement something different. To me, that's just in your answer, that's very profound.
Thank you. Wow.
And it changes things. I would imagine
it does.
That it has capacity to change things.
It does. And that's kind of what I feel like and, you know, a collective, all of us, those of us who I'm finding vibrating, I feel like we're on the precipice of something like that, because it is empowering. And it's the only thing that even makes sense to do with our time, to me, anymore. Because, you know, as you know, my wife passed away December 28th of 2017. So we're coming up on a year. And, you know, watching and witnessing and having the privilege of having had Jamela in my life. One thing I know, I do not have time to waste. No one does, you know, and to honor her spirit and all of our ancestors, you know, the time we spend here is precious.
Yes.
I know you know that. And, you know, that's why I love you, you know, and even though it was pouring down rain outside, I said, Sister Angela, Rev. Doctor, you know, all the things. Angela always says we are celebrating the power of showing up. That's I said, right. So I'm going to show up.
That's right.
I might be 45 minutes late, half an hour to 45 minutes late, but I'm going to show up, you know, and I love that.
Our listeners should know that you made it through, I'm going to say storm, because it could very well be storm, but certainly rain and wind. But you made your way here.
Indeed.
And I think that really exemplifies what is happening with some people I know in the field of education, who are making their way into some of these incredible places, who are bringing womanist and Black feminist ideologies and saying, hey, we need to rethink policy and procedures, and to make a note of what's happening to our kids.
Exactly.
You had mentioned earlier, if we could actually appreciate some of that diversity, things would be different. Speak a little bit more about that.
That diversity, you know, is what I guess they call it from a institutional perspective. But to me, it's just my reality, you know, and that's what it is. And that's what I spoke on at the Keynote. It was my first ever Keynote, and it was a very, very inspirational experience, I think, preparing for it, and even having the opportunity to deliver it and talk about it afterwards, and even in the couple days since, just keep thinking about it and get a few more people's feedback like, you're onto something, girl. And so I like that, because I feel like I'm onto something. So basically I call it Enzymatic Pedagogies, and there are three specific womanist practices that I call forth for teachers and for students to start practicing. And this could be teachers from, I believe, everybody connected to teachers and education, K-12, would benefit by this, you know, doing this. And I just choose the three that make most sense to me. But there are other you know, avenues to get the desired effect. So those three things are Prana, interconnectedness, and energy transmutation. And so I'll explain what those are. So prana is breath. I learned that word from my yoga practice. It's an ancient Hindi word, and it speaks about breath. Prana also refers to the life force, which is us, and that our physical bodies are just that. There are shells, but they do not contain our spiritual life force, or ancestral life force, universal life force. Prana is all of that, and we can practice paying attention to our breath and raising our awareness about our breath as teachers and students as a way to increase the oxygen in our blood flow. So I knew about that. Like, that's what I was been thinking about for a couple years, that oxygen is beneficial to us as humans. So then I was introduced by a friend and a colleague with whom I'm co-editing a book. Her name is Dr. Natalia Jaramillo, and she has been at KSU for 5 years. We started working on this book project about 5 years ago, and we're still working on it, but we did just get a book contract.
Wonderful.
Yes, with University of Illinois Press in a womanisms series edited by Ana Louise Keating, who is a scholar in that area of spiritual education.
Wow.
So it's really exciting. And Natalia introduced me to decolonial studies. And so for the last 5 years, I've been reading Frantz Fanon and bell hooks from her decolonial lenses, Freire, W.E.B. Du Bois in new ways, just studying the concept of decoloniality, and how we are still contemporarily living in such a colonial society that once and if we acknowledge that, then our resistance can be tailored to that, but we have to acknowledge it first. So certainly schools, K-12 schools, are instruments and locales of oppression. Even Fanon talks about, like, after a while, the people in power don't have to work as hard because they have police, in buildings, like on the exterior of the compound of whoever's leading. And those police carry out, what happens. That's how I feel schools are now.
Particularly as we talk about the variable of in-school shootings.
Exactly. In-school shootings, in-school police forces.
Yes.
Atlanta City Schools has its own police department.
Wow.
Atlanta City Schools Police Department. And that was a new initiative.
I didn't know that. Of
the new superintendent. She's been here about 3-4 years. Karstoff. And she was like, yeah, we don't want to. So, I mean, this is how militarized and police our kids are. And of course, we know it's Black and brown kids. And, they're really literally living in a police state, when they go to school.
Yes.
So prana is the first thing, like I was talking about. Interconnectedness is the second thing. And that's like what you and I have, and all of us, I think, who were in Sister Harriet, we know we have a vibration that makes us feel good, and it's a friendship, it's a kinship, it's intergenerational, and it's like we know it in our heart because it makes us feel good, might calm our anxiety or make us laugh, or it's a positive thing, when we're around each other, and we can feel that in ourselves. And then the third thing is energy transmutation. And that is something that actually was the topic of my whole chapter for this same book that I was just talking about. It's called Unsettling Curriculums. That's the title of our book, because we're trying to use decolonial theory from many different perspectives to see how we can disrupt the curriculum of the status quo. And so the main thing that my chapter had been about was about this third one, which is energy transmutation, which is something that I experienced for the first time as a middle school student. And am still involved with in different ways. So as a middle school student, I grew up in Ithaca, New York, predominantly white town, schools, everything. And I had a teacher who pulled me aside and a few other kids. I don't even remember, matter of fact, who all the other kids were in the group. But she pulled us aside and she was like, I want to teach y'all African and African American history. Come to my classroom after school Tuesdays and be a part of this culture club. And I was, and that was my first experience. You know, now I can look back 30 years later and realize that's what she did. Miss Welch was a Black woman, Miss Welch, who I'm still now connected with on Facebook. And I have told her this once I realized it over the last 5 or so years. She was transmutating energy from the colonial curriculum that we all got in social studies at a regular old humdrum small town America middle school in New York State, and bending that curriculum into making time and space for young Black kids to learn about Black history. And to me, that became the defining way that as an educator, we can transmute energy. And so in high school, I joined a similar group. It was Miss Salisbury. She was the librarian, and another Black woman who was the sponsor to that group, and it was called Pathfinders. And then when I got to college, University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and I was in my teacher preparation programs, I realized that the Black kids in Charlottesville High School, of course, were experiencing the same thing we did when we were Black kids in Ithaca, New York. So some of my friends and I, we were in a group that one of my friends started called the Griot Society. And she had started it for people who were majoring and minoring in in AAS, in African American Studies, because, almost like as a, camaraderie, but also like, we know we're majoring in this, but it's risky because it's not like history, which I took so that I could get a job after college. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that I've even identified as some of the roots of coloniality. So you're trying to tell me I have to take this white canonized history and get this history degree at University of Virginia, of all places, to be able to be eligible to be in the teacher education program, to be able to carry on the colonial curriculum. Whereas if I were to major in AAS, I couldn't even be in your teacher education program, So she had started that group for that. So some of us who were in that group started a Saturday school called Know Your History, which was every other Saturday for these Charlottesville teens. And it was an amazing experience. And they all learned and researched someone in history. And we had a huge event at the end where they spoke as their historical characters. So, someone was Malcolm X, someone was Booker T. Washington, and they were on campus. So these are high school kids just getting to come to the college campus and speak in the amphitheater, and all our friends were out there cheering them on. So that was another example of, okay, now I've learned this from Miss Welch and Miss Salisbury. Now it's my turn to start transmuting energy. So I did that, with Latasha and the other people, to create that Saturday school. And then when I became a high school teacher right around the corner from here, East Point, GA, Tri-Cities High School.
Oh, wow.
I don't know. I do remember being surprised at first that there was not a Black History Club at this all Black school. That was 17 years ago. So I think I have a much more nuanced and deep understanding of why there was no Black History Club there now. But as a recent graduate, from undergrad, as 22, 23, I didn't know. But I started a Know Your History Club there at Tri-Cities. I mean, literally, I was just doing what Miss Welsh and Miss Salisbury taught me, because we had it after school Tuesdays, just like I had done from 6th to 8th grade, after school Tuesdays. And these kids came, and it was only ever like probably 6 or 7 tops, but it was always 4. It was always 3 or 4, And so it was just these small collection of kids who just love Black history. And they would come, we went, the MARTA's right around the corner from the school. So we would go to the MLK Center together. We went on little field trips. We went to the High. We went to see a movie once, and it was just Black, African and African American history. So that's what I have learned. That's my gift. Like, that's what I can do. I know how to do it because I got to be the beneficiary of it, as a kid. And so that's what I see myself doing. That's an example of energy transmutation. So for the keynote, I was so honored to be asked to speak at this particular pre-conference. It's brand new. This is the second year they've had it, and it's called the Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin pre-conference for K-12 teachers, because it's really bringing together my two loves, which is K-12 education and teachers and kids, and feminism and womanisms. And so I was like, oh, this is my time, y'all. This is my time, Yes. So it all came together. And so, but what I wanted to do, instead of just saying everything that I just said to you and have the teachers be like, but what should we do on Monday? I wanted to bring in very concrete examples, because that's obviously a very valid thing for teachers to want, So I believe my job is to help translate kind of maybe larger cultural movements, into teachable units, or better yet, teach teachers how to do that process so that they can, distill things down to how you could teach it to a kindergartner. And I like the process of doing that. But I did want to make it very concrete. So for Prana, I reached out to a friend of mine, Cheryl Crawford, who has done so many amazing things around Atlanta with yoga. She's done a lot with a nonprofit that I think she founded called Grounded Kids, where she's brought yoga into a lot of schools, elementary schools around the 4 metro counties. So that's been really nice. She started a nonprofit called Georgia Breathes, and it is based around, again, wanting to work with teachers and administrators and kids on raising our awareness about breath. So I asked her to send an audio. I actually asked her to send a video, but she sent an audio, which was fine, of her describing what Georgia Breathes is, so that the teachers at the keynote could hear, okay, this is what she means. Like, this is what I mean when I say prana, as connected to womanism, like grounded down into this nonprofit organization that's very tangible. And you can, invite Cheryl Crawford into your room or into your school or into your district, and she will bring this, and teach you how to do it. It always runs a risk, and I'm very aware as I just enter into it farther. It's very close to and overlapping with cultural appropriation, undoubtedly. So there are ways. So I feel very uncomfortable about that part, and there are still ways that I want to think about how I engage with it so that it is not that. But for the middle one, interconnectedness, I was able to find a little clip of Alexis Pauline Gumbs talking about it online. And I found a clip of her talking about her mobile homecoming project. And that, to me, that's the epitome of what I mean when I say interconnectedness. So I played a, 3-minute clip of Alexis sharing about the mobile homecoming project, again, for the teachers to see, okay, this is what this looks like actualized. And then the third was my old friend, now Dr. Latasha Levy, who lives in Oregon, I believe, and is a professor out there. She just recently moved, who was the person with whom I co-founded the Know Your History Saturday School in college with. And I have always been blown away by her centeredness, her academic brilliance, her connections to Blackness, and her leadership, and her style. She's real fly. And so when I reached out, because I was like, okay, who can I get? I actually reached out to her and Mrs. Welch. And I didn't hear back from Miss Welch. And so I didn't hear back from Miss Welch, but I did hear back from Latasha. And I just want to say something about Miss Welch. When it all came and I posted it on Facebook, Miss Welch did put a heart by it. So I know she knows it's going on, and I know she knows that I attribute this to her.
Yes.
You know, so I reached out to them saying, can you all be the tangible example, you know, for me to share what energy transmutation looks like, because you two were my first teachers of that. And when Latasha sent her thing back, she talked about how she uses journaling in her classrooms with her undergraduate students or with her university students to help them learn to trust themselves. And so she talked about, you know, so many times we don't trust students to develop their own skills of critique. I'm not sure if those were her exact words, but she was speaking about the value of teaching students to trust in themselves. And that is done through extensive reading, of course, but also journaling.
Wow.
Yes. And that was what she spoke of in terms of her current pedagogical practice that helps with energy transmutation. So being able to share that with the people was amazing. So then I'll just wrap it up with this, because this is where it really meant something to me. Afterwards, a few people shared. And one of the young teachers, I'm sure she was in her early 20s, New York, very New York, born and raised, teaches in a classroom in New York, said, you know, the nonprofit I told you all about that I founded because we had gone around and everybody had introduced themselves and what had brought them to the conversation, which was really nice. That took about an hour. There were about 12 to 15 people there, I would say. And, she said, what I did not tell you all is that the nonprofit is called Breathe.
Oh, wow.
You know, so we had that moment of Black women around the table.
Yeah.
And Latinx and 3 white women around the table having that moment of like, oh, wow. And then another young woman shared, and she was crying. And she said, you know, this is just so right on time for me. She was from another state, maybe Pennsylvania. I don't know. These teachers were from all over the country. And she said, because I do feel like I'm able to do the energy transmutation that you were talking about with my young kids. I think she was an elementary school teacher. She said, but after they leave the classroom, I just feel so depleted. She said, so Tuesday, when I get home from this conference, I've already made an appointment for Tuesday morning. And she said, I made this appointment last week. And so I'm thinking, you know, she's going to go and see her therapist. She said, I made an appointment with my tattoo artist. And Tuesday morning, I have already planned to get the word breathe written backwards on my collarbone so that every time, because my father always tells me I need to breathe. And this woman, you know, she was probably 25 years old, you know, early 20s. And she said, you know, so this is just amazing. So at that point, it lifted up even higher.
Wow. And
so that's why and how I kind of feel like, you know, in that cheesy cliche kind of way, I'm on to something, you know, except then all of a sudden it's not cheesy and cliche because all of a sudden it's really happening.
And life affirming, life giving. Yes.
Circular.
Yes.
Yes.
D all of the above. Yes.
D all of the above and all of that, you know, so it's coming. It's happening.
And as you were talking, it's so funny because I'm like, okay, prana, interdependence, energy, transmutation, spiritual education in the state of Georgia. My God, that's like a Black woman running for governor. Could that ever happen? Could that ever happen in the state of Georgia?
Love it.
And what we see is that people are doing the work they need to do in the time in which they need to do it with the giftedness they have, and they're changing the biosphere.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Stacey Abrams has done that with this race she has done here in Georgia for governor. And you are doing the work you need to do in education.
Thank you.
To make that difference in the state of Georgia. And I believe now is our time.
Now is that time.
But if we don't breathe, we won't be here to do the work we're called to do.
Okay.
You know?
Okay.
I want to briefly, before we begin to come to a close, I want to then think about in some imaginary way of how we would transpose these three ideas of prana, interdependence, and energy transmutation into the lived experience of those who are listening to us, namely older Black lesbians who sometimes we forget to breathe, mm-hmm. and sometimes we forget some of these other issues. So how can we implement in a very brief way those three things in our lives so that we can literally keep the fluid moving in our brain and be in good vibrations with each other?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really an attention and awareness, certainly mindfulness, mm-hmm. of time and place. I do find, and I had been reading earlier in the year just about habit forming, mm-hmm. and how most of what we do is out of habit. So to pay attention to what our habits are and then to intercede those that we don't like and, start practicing new ones. I think that's a great way for all of us to maybe enter into some of these womanist practices and traditions. I think particularly because they are womanist, mm-hmm. I don't think that they are something that we necessarily as Black lesbians have to learn. Mm-hmm. I think it might be, like you were saying, something we have to remember, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that brings me to a book that I would just like to speak on that's been very influential in my understanding, and that is titled Learning to Remember the Things We've Learned to Forget. And that's by a scholar named Dr. Cynthia Dillard. She's a endowed chair at the University of Georgia College of Education. Brilliant woman. She has a school in Ghana that she has opened up. And she's an elder, mm-hmm. in my field. Mm-hmm. And she talks a lot about remembering, and that how as Black women, we have those abilities, and so she definitely helps. I recommend her writing because she helps one understand kind of how to do it also. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I know you are the coordinator of the Zamie Noble Book Hub, and you are the quintessential book nerd with a backpack full of books here in front of you. What are you reading? What are some things we may want to pick up as well?
So right here I have just a few that I'll mention. One is really my Bible. And if I were to identify one particular holy book, it would be The Womanist Idea by Layli Mapayan. The Womanist Idea is a book by a mentor of mine. Also, she's in the academy. I knew her from when she was a professor at Georgia State. She's now the director of the Wesleyan Women's Studies Institute, I believe. I'm not sure if it's called an institute, but it's something really amazing. Wow. And she's pretty amazing. And so she, in this book, writes about womanism, I guess, in ways that really connected with my experience, mm-hmm. or really connect with my experience. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like what you were asking about, how can we use these womanist principles in ways that make sense? I think one thing that I learned from Layli and from this book in particular is just that we can all practice the principles, but the specifics will be different, mm-hmm. for each person, mm-hmm. And that's the beauty of it. So a few other books that I would like to mention are Unapologetic, A Black Queer and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements by Charlene Carruthers. She came to Caris a month or two ago, and it was right on time. And it's been a great manual. It's also very practical. What Carruthers does in this book is that she talks about her own experiences as a young person growing up in Chicago and her own coming into feminist knowledge, feminist, certainly like the academic canon, and then her activism and her world travels. It's a synthesis, but at the same time, it has some very practical steps in there. So we're just following her lead. She's the founder of the Black Youth Project that is based in Chicago. So it's clearly been working for her, and I'm just honored to be a part of that type of energy.
You know, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about what a difference Mrs. Hubert and Miss Couchman made in my life in 7th grade and 9th grade and 10th grade. And I can't overestimate the power of a good teacher in one's life. So knowing that you are doing the work to help teachers make that difference is just very special. So I'm so glad that you were here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing in our Black lesbian history.
Thank you for everything. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here, for creating the space. I appreciate you.
Breathe, breathe, breathe. It's 2019 and there's so many wonderful things you want to do and are called to do in this world. Breathe, breathe, breathe. Thank you, Jillian Ford, for sharing with us those 3 important steps we can take not only in the classroom, but in our daily lives. Thank you all for listening to our first episode of the new year. We are so looking forward to your being a part of our listening audience. And as always, if you like what you hear, let us know. Write a review and rate the podcast in iTunes. You can leave comments anywhere you enjoy our podcast. Thanks again for listening. And as always, have a sweet one.